Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to dive into the gates. Tonight, we recount the epic saga, the complete life story of a hunter who started with nothing and became a legend. This is the tale of Han Songyi. In a world shattered by dungeons and monstrous gates, our story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper. Han Songyi was an E-rank hunter, the lowest of the low. In the eyes of the Hunters Association and the powerful guilds, she was practically invisible, a background character in her own life. While S ranks like the mighty Sung Jin-Woo battled dragons, she faced the daily struggle of being overlooked, her potential locked away like a dungeon waiting for the right key. She was the underdog we all root for, the character whose journey we knew was destined for so much more. But every great anime has its inciting incident. A miraculous event, a system reset, a chance encounter that changes everything. For Han Songyi, her moment arrived. Perhaps it was surviving a dungeon break she shouldn't have, or a latent power awakening in a moment of desperate need. Suddenly, the world that ignored her was forced to watch. She was no longer an NPC, she was a player. This was her power-up sequence, the moment the screen cracks with energy and a new, intimidating status screen appears. The path from zero to hero had begun. The world of solo leveling operates on a brutal, unyielding logic: power is everything. It is a world categorized, sorted, and defined by the shimmering threat of the gates and the hunters who stand against them. But this system of defense is itself a rigid caste structure, a pyramid where the view from the bottom is one of shadows and struggle. To be an E-rank hunter is to exist in the foundation of that pyramid, bearing the immense weight of those above, forever unseen and uncelebrated. This was the stark reality that shaped the early chapters of Han Songyi's life, a story not of glorious beginnings, but of quiet, relentless endurance. Her daily existence was a masterclass in institutional neglect. The Hunters Association, for all its bureaucratic efficiency, had no real place for an E-ranker like her. She was a line item, a statistic to be managed, not an asset to be cultivated. Obtaining raid licenses involved navigating a maze of dismissive clerks and redundant paperwork, where her E-rank status was a scarlet letter that prompted sighs and eye rolls. Guild recruitment was a special kind of humiliation. While the famous guilds, with their S-ranked celebrities, occupied glamorous, high-tech booths, their recruiters' eyes would slide over her without a flicker of recognition. She was invisible. The offers that did come were not for a hunter, but for a pack mule. Porter was the official title, but the job description was simple: carry the loot, stay out of the way, and if a real fight breaks out, your only duty is to die quietly so the real hunters have a better chance to escape. Every contract she signed felt less like employment and more like a waiver of her own dignity. This professional marginalization was compounded by a precarious financial reality that was a constant, gnawing source of stress. The world saw the S-ranks on television, living in penthouses and driving hypercars, their wealth as legendary as their powers. For Han Songyi, the economics of survival were a delicate and terrifying balancing act. The payment for a low-level dungeon raid was a pittance, barely enough to cover the rent on a tiny, single-room apartment in a neighborhood where the glow of the city's neon signs was a dim, distant promise. Hunter insurance was a luxury she could not afford, meaning every mission was a gamble with her life and her financial future. A single sprain, a minor magical burn, could mean medical bills that would take years to pay off, trapping her in a cycle of debt. This financial sword of Damocles dictated her every move. It was the reason she swallowed her pride and accepted the porter roles, why she nodded silently when party leaders belittled her. Pride couldn't pay the electricity bill. Courage couldn't put food on the table. In this world, her E-ranked status wasn't just a measure of her power, it was a determinant of her poverty. The external battles, however, were only half the story. The internal landscape of an E-rank hunter is a terrain of profound isolation and psychological warfare. She possessed a spark of power, enough to feel the ebb and flow of mana, to sense the monstrous auras lurking within the gates. Yet, this ability was a curse in disguise. It was like having a highly sensitive alarm system wired directly to her soul, screaming of imminent danger, while being physically chained to the floor, utterly incapable of stopping it. This created a unique and agonizing form of cognitive dissonance. She was both hyper-aware of the threat and completely powerless against it. This powerlessness bred a deep, grinding anxiety that colored every moment inside a dungeon. For a D rank dungeon might be a routine chore. For Han Songyi, it was a tense, heart-pounding ordeal where every shadow could hold death. Her vigilance was not the focused readiness of a warrior, but the frantic, trapped animal fear of prey. This reality fostered an immense loneliness. She was trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. To ordinary civilians, she was still one of those, hunters, and other, viewed with a mixture of vague fear and curiosity. But within the hunter community, she was a non-entity. In raid parties, she was the silent observer. The D and C rank hunters would joke, strategize, and bond over their shared experiences, their camaraderie forming an invisible wall that she could not cross. Conversations would falter when she approached, plans were made without her input. She was a piece of equipment, a living backpack, and she was treated as such. To survive socially, she had to practice a kind of emotional invisibility, making herself small, quiet, and unassuming to avoid drawing attention or ire. Every day was a lesson in absorbing casual humiliation without reaction, in swallowing words of protest or suggestions that were never asked for. The constant state of being undervalued and overlooked was a slow drip of acid on her spirit. This was the crucible of Han Songyi's early life. There were no grand battles for glory, only a daily, desperate struggle for survival and a sliver of self-respect. It was a life defined by the weight of a single letter, E. It meant empty pockets, lonely nights, and the cold fear that accompanied every step into the unknown. Yet, it was within this harsh and unforgiving environment that the core of her character was forged. The humility learned from the bottom would later keep her grounded. The empathy born from her own powerlessness would make her a compassionate leader. The keen observational skills, honed from a position of constant assessment and threat analysis, would become one of her greatest strengths. The resilience built from enduring 1,000 small cuts would prepare her for the monumental challenges to come. She was a seed in frozen, barren ground, dormant and overlooked, waiting for the one, miraculous change in season that would allow her to finally, and spectacularly, bloom. If the life of an E-rank hunter was a state of perpetual gray, then the turning point for Han Songyi was a supernova, a cataclysmic, reality-shattering event that vaporized the world she knew and forged a new one in its place. It was not a gentle awakening, but a violent rebirth. For Jin-Woo, it was the system; for others, it might be a hidden potential unlocked in a brush with death. For Han Songyi, it was her own personal miracle, an anomaly that defied the very laws that governed their world. The catalyst was likely a raid that went catastrophically wrong, a scenario all too familiar to low-rank hunters, but this one was different. Perhaps it was a gate that was mis-ranked, AC or even AB rank dungeon masquerading as AD rank, a fatal error in the association's judgment. Her party, a mix of D ranks and a few other E rank porters like herself, would have been utterly outmatched from the start. The air, thick with the stench of blood and ozone, would have been filled with the screams of the dying, the shattering of armor, and the guttural roars of creatures they were never meant to face. In the chaos, Han Songyi would have been separated, cornered, facing a monster whose mere aura was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. This was the moment, not a training montage, not a wise mentor's guidance, but the raw, unfiltered brink of oblivion. In that absolute nadir, as death's shadow fell over her, something broke. Or perhaps, something clicked. It wasn't an external voice, like the system that spoke to Jin-Woo, but an internal one, a fundamental law of the universe rewriting itself within her very cells. It could have been a latent, genetic trait, a quirk of her lineage that had lain dormant for generations, waiting for a specific, near-lethal surge of adrenaline and mana exposure to activate. Or, in a world where the absolute authority of the system existed, her transformation could have been a side effect, a ripple in the code. Perhaps the system, in its quest to create the ultimate soldier, inadvertently altered the mana field of the entire planet, and Han Songyi was one of the rare individuals whose body didn't just adapt, but evolved in response, creating her own unique, parallel progression path. The physical sensation would have been agonizing and ecstatic all at once. It would have started as a searing heat in her core, as if she had swallowed a star. Every nerve ending would have been set alight, not with pain, but with a terrifying, overwhelming awareness. She would have felt the microscopic structures of her body breaking down and reassembling, her muscles' fibers weaving themselves into something denser, stronger. Her bones would have hummed with energy, becoming less like calcium and more like crystallized mana. The faint, flickering candle of her E-rank power was snuffed out, and in its place, a forge of immense power roared to life. Her perception of the world would have shifted irrevocably. The dark, terrifying dungeon would have become a landscape of clear, quantifiable data. She could see the flow of mana, not just sense it vaguely. She could track the weaknesses in the monster's hide, perceived the minute shifts in its stance that telegraphed its next attack. The world slowed down. The roaring monster, which a second before was a blur of lethal motion, now seemed to be moving through thick syrup. Its movements were clumsy, predictable. This was the player's mind, the heightened state of awareness that separated the truly powerful from the fodder. And then came the first, instinctual use of her new power. It wouldn't have been a grand, named technique. It would have been pure, undirected will. As the monster lunged for the final blow, her own survival instinct, now supercharged, would have lashed out. Perhaps it was a wave of pure force, an invisible hammer that slammed into the creature and pulverized it into a fine red mist. Perhaps it was a speed she never knew she possessed, moving her body in an impossible blur, her hand, now clad in an ephemeral, shimmering energy, punching straight through the monster's chest. However it manifested, the result was the same, instantaneous, absolute annihilation of a threat that should have killed her. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed, the reality of what happened would have crashed down upon her. She would have stood there, surrounded by the carnage, her body thrumming with unfamiliar power, her clothes perhaps torn and singed, but her skin unbroken. The feeling would be one of profound disorientation and terrifying clarity. She would look at her hands, half expecting to see them covered in blood, but instead, they might be wreathed in a faint, dying luminescence. The interface of her power wouldn't be a blue screen like Jin-Woo's, but something more intuitive, a feeling in her gut, a whisper on the wind, a HUD that only she could see projected directly onto her mind's eye, showing her vitals, her mana reserves, and the simple, staggering truth, she was no longer E-rank. This was the moment Han Songyi, the ghost, the porter, the afterthought, died. In her place stood something new. A question mark, an anomaly, a player in a game she never knew she was enrolled in. The path forward was no longer a narrow, predestined road of struggle and obscurity. It was now a vast, open field of limitless potential, shrouded in the mist of the unknown. The journey of understanding what she had become, of mastering this tempest within her, and of carving a new identity in a world that had already written her off, had just begun. The underdog had been given fangs, and the hunt was about to change forever. The miracle was the spark, but the true fire had to be built, fed, and controlled through sheer, unrelenting effort. The awakening of Han Songyi's latent power did not instantly grant her mastery, it handed her a raw, untamed storm and the monumental task of learning to command the lightning. This period was her crucible, a grueling, often solitary training arc where the hunter was not just born, but forged. Her first and most formidable opponent was not a monster from a gate, but the power within herself. This new, immense energy was a wild, bucking stallion inside her veins, refusing the reins. Early attempts to channel it were fraught with disaster. A simple intention to strengthen her punch could result in a concussive blast that shattered the concrete wall of a training facility. A wish to move faster could see her slam into a barrier with bone-jarring force, her control over momentum not yet refined. The power was there, immense and intoxicating, but it was clumsy. It responded to her emotions, frustration, fear, surprise, more readily than her will. She had to learn the precise grammar of this new language her body spoke, moving from screaming incoherent shouts to whispering lethal sonnets. This meant endless, repetitive drills in secluded spaces, focusing mana into a single fingertip, holding a barrier for minutes, then hours, on end, practicing the same movement 10,000 times until it was not a thought, but an instinct carved into her muscle memory. This internal struggle was mirrored by external, physical trials. Knowing her body was now capable of more, she pushed it to its absolute limits and then beyond. Her training regimen became legendary in its brutality. She would venture into low-level dungeons not to clear them, but to use them as living training grounds. She would confront a pack of goblins not with her newfound overwhelming power, but by restricting herself, using only her enhanced speed to evade, or only a sliver of her strength to parry, turning each encounter into a focused lesson in precision and control. She fought until her muscles screamed and her mana reserves were drained to the dregs, then pushed further. She learned to embrace the pain, not as a signal to stop, but as a map of her own limitations she was determined to redraw every single day. Yet, this journey was not one of cold, isolated ascension. Her resolve was constantly tested by the burgeoning weight of responsibility. With every level of power she unlocked, the world around her began to shift. The same hunters who once ignored her now watched her with a mixture of awe, fear, and envy. She began to encounter threats that only she could handle. A sudden dungeon break in a populated area, a high-rank monster that evaded the association's net. These were no longer events she could run from. They were her tests. In these moments, the training met reality. The controlled exercises in focus were now needed to protect a panicking civilian. The practiced combat maneuvers were the only thing standing between a city block and total destruction. Every victory was a confirmation of her growth, but it also chained her to a heavier burden. She was no longer fighting for her own survival or her own redemption, she was fighting for them. This was the final, essential element in the forging of her resolve. It was the understanding that her power was not a weapon for vanity, but a shield for the powerless. It was this realization that transformed her from a mere recipient of great power into a true hunter, her spirit tempered in the fires of discipline and duty, unbreakable and resolute. The legacy of a hunter is not written in the brief, bright flashes of their most famous battles, but in the enduring light they leave behind. For Han Songyi, her rise from E-rank obscurity was not a path she walked alone, it became a road that others could follow, and her legacy was carved not just in the shadows of dungeons, but in the hearts of those she inspired. She became a living testament to a radical idea in their rigid world, that a hunter's worth is not a fixed value assigned by the system, but a potential waiting to be unlocked. Her renown grew not from seeking fame, but from a consistent, unwavering courage that could not be ignored. Where other high-ranking hunters might pick their battles for maximum glory or profit, Han Songyi answered every call. She was the one who would appear at a chaotic dungeon break, not with the dramatic flair of an S rank, but with the calm, focused determination of someone who understood that every second counted. Civilians and low-rank hunters began to speak her name not as a distant, untouchable celebrity, but as a guardian. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, a symbol that the powerless could become powerful, not through a lucky break, but through unyielding integrity and heart. She became the People's Hunter, a title bestowed not by the association, but by the very people she protected, and it held more weight than any official rank. Within the hunter community, her impact was equally profound. She single-handedly redefined what it meant to be strong. In a culture that worshipped raw, destructive power, Han Songyi demonstrated that true strength was a triad: power, yes, but also precision and, most surprisingly, compassion. She was often seen mentoring low-rank hunters, not with condescension, but with a hard-won empathy. She would station herself at the rear of a training raid, not as a porter, but as a silent safeguard, allowing newer hunters to test their limits with the unspoken knowledge that a safety net of immense power stood behind them. This fostered a new kind of loyalty and camaraderie. The hunters who fought beside her developed a faith that was deeper than fear, it was trust. They knew she would never retreat while a single comrade stood in danger, and they knew her judgment in the heat of battle was rooted in a desire to preserve life, not just to secure victory. Ultimately, Han Songyi's legacy transcended her own power level. She became a fixed point in a shifting world, a symbol of hope's tangible power. For every E-rank hunter facing despair, her story was a beacon, a proven fact that the label on your license does not define the hero you can become. For the public, she was the human face of an often inhuman profession, a reminder that the walls protecting them were held up by people with fears, doubts, and an incredible capacity for courage. She did not just climb the ranks, she rewrote the rules of the game, proving that the greatest strength a hunter can possess is not the power to destroy a monster, but the will to protect a humanity that includes oneself. Her story became a legend, not for the enemies she felled, but for the hope she raised, a legacy that would inspire generations of hunters to look beyond the system and find the hero within.